thank you all for coming today, and I'm excited to talk about my favorite topic for those of you who see me tweet way too much and swear a lot about occupational licensing. But I'm really excited to talk about it with our panel. There's so much to say about it, and there's so many sides of it, from like, what should we license, to why do we license things? Is it the best system? Obviously not always. When immigrants come here, they can't get licensed because we don't have processes for that. People are trained in prisons to do jobs that they can't do when they get out. So there's so many sides of it, and I'm really excited to get to it. So first, I want to start off with a question to our panel. We have so many regulations in the United States that we don't even know how many there are, which is a famous thing that's bad. So out of all those many, many regulations, why is it worth focusing on the problems with occupational licensing?
So I think I would start out with just how many people it affects, right? So it's about 1 in 4 American workers have to get some kind of occupational license. And the really big issue with that is that it ends up infringing on pretty fundamental liberties, right? Which is the personal liberty to, the freedom to earn a living. And so I think that's why we should focus on this more than other regulations, just simply because of how many people it affects.
So I'll speak to licensing from I guess, a boring macroeconomic perspective. So I apologize about that. But what ends up happening with licensing is you really handicap the small businesses. And when we look at what's happening in this country today, we have a debt to GDP ratio that is over 100%. This is a huge problem in this country. So what do we need to do? We need to increase the GDP. We need to increase productivity. We need to enhance our small businesses, give them incentives to start and create productivity, create GDP. But licensing will do the opposite. It will handicap them. So we really need to take this issue seriously and consider all aspects.
Well, I'm glad you're here to talk about macro, because I much prefer micro. I'm going to quote my running mate again, and hopefully not mangle his saying as much as I did last night, but Harry Brown used to say that the government breaks your leg and then expects you to be grateful when it hands you a crutch. And that's exactly what's going on with licensing laws. Thanks to licensing laws, people have a hard time getting out of poverty. People who are in poverty, by definition, are there because they don't have the money, which means they don't have the money to go to expensive classes. Oftentimes, these classes are run by the very competitors who really don't want to see any more competition. And so then the government comes along and says, oh, well, too bad, I guess you're not smart enough or skilled enough to get a job. And it's like, no, you're keeping me from getting a job. And then the government says, well, here's welfare for you. And the people who are receiving the welfare would much rather be working. And we've got a government who, once again, is in charge of everything, trying to be benevolent.
So occupational licensing occurs at all levels. You have lawyers and doctors, but you also have florists and fortune tellers. The fortune teller one is really funny because you just need to be a certified fortune teller to work. It's all local licensing. Most are state, lots of localities want to make sure you're a legitimate fortune teller. So at the side of like over-regulating doctors, making it harder to have access to care on that side, or whether it's like even certified public accountants, making it harder for people to have access to financial information, or at the other end, the fortune tellers and the florists. In each of your views, which kind of licensing is the biggest problem? Is it at one end, at the other end? Is it in the middle? Is it kind of a mix of all of them?
Well, I'm not sure that I can quite quantify which is worse, because you can find different ways to be infuriated about either. Like on the one hand, say doctors that limit the scope of practice for nurses makes it really difficult for people to get essential health care, but also it's particularly infuriating to see, just how many hours you need to be a licensed hair braider. So I think I'd rather focus on like a particular form of occupational licensing that really gets my goat, and that's Washington, D.C. requiring an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree with a concentration in early childhood education to be a preschool teacher. And I think that the particular irony with that one is that the people who sold it said basically, look, every child deserves high quality daycare. And the argument is that, if you have this extra level of education, it will guarantee that, which for one, I'm sure a daycare teacher who's been doing his or her job for 20 years knows a thing or two about early childhood education. But then also the irony is that, when you require this onerous licensing, daycare in DC is already topping $20,000 a year on average. It'll only cause the prices to increase by further artificially restricting the supply of daycare teachers. And so what it'll actually end up doing is meaning that fewer kids end up in high quality daycare because their parents are gonna go, well, it costs way too much, so one of us should just quit our jobs and stay home with the kids.
So I don't know which one's worse. I'm very much a fan of let the business decide, let the consumer decide. If you go to a doctor and that doctor doesn't have a license or a degree or a certain certification, that's your choice to go to that doctor and maybe pay a smaller fee because they don't have that. That is your choice, and that is their choice as a business, as a doctor, to operate in that environment. They may not get as many clients, or they may get many clients. Let the market decide, right? Let the free market decide what happens. If that business owner looks around and says, wait a minute, I'm not getting so many clients, and maybe I need to go get a license as a result to get more clients, then that's free market. They should look around them and say, if I want to be in this business, I need to go ahead and get that license. Let them decide. Don't leave it to the government to impose certain licenses, right? Let the consumer vote with their feet. Let them go to the grocery store and purchase organic vegetables. Now, they may pay more for those organic vegetables because they're, those farmers may be licensed and there's a higher cost to producing organic fruits and vegetables. That's great. But let the consumer vote with their feet and with their dollars whether they want to purchase organic or not. Do not impose that requirement from a government perspective to all farmers and say all farmers must be organic because that's goodness, that the government decides that's goodness, right? Leave it to the consumer to vote with their dollars and with their own feet.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, for sure. So sorry, I know that we had so much in between. So basically, which do you think is a bigger problem? Like the licensing of doctors or the over-licensing of doctors or like the florists and the, everything there, or the in the middle space?
Well, I hate to be such a utilitarian, but you got to look at what works. And a recent study showed that licensing of dentists didn't do any good. And if you think about it, our country is already so overregulated with who gets into school, how many dentists and doctors there are, who gets to pass the boards. I mean, they've already gone through so many steps. That's essentially licensing built in. But, it's funny that you talk about medical versus the florists. To show how arbitrary it is, some people at Cato had pointed out that in Florida, it was something like it took 110 hours for emergency medical technicians to get licensed, but something like 1,800 hours for an interior designer. So that shows that safety is not the #1 concern. It's basically people up for a power grab. And I'd like to expand on what you were saying about choice. It really goes beyond choice. It goes to competition. And what's very frustrating is so many of the people who want the licensing laws, which tend to be from the left, they're the ones who are called progressives. But the way that we become progressive is through competition. And I teach psychology. One of the classes I teach sometimes is social psychology, which is about the most liberal, dare I say fascist arm of the psychology fields. At one social psychology conference, they asked how many people were liberal, how many were conservative. Of course, they haven't heard of libertarians yet. But like out of 800 social psychologists there, it was a ridiculous number, like there were only 6 conservatives. The rest of them are liberal. And yet, despite that, my social psychology book points out that you've got cooperation and competition, and that competition brings progress. And they use that word, and yet the progressives are not trying to get the competition. And the example I use in class about competition is, hey, how much do you like your iPhones? You know, the reason you have your iPhone is because Steve Jobs and Bill Gates pretty much hated each other and wanted to outdo each other, and it was through competition. And so what's ironic, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to give such a long answer.
I love it.
But what's ironic is that having licensing is supposed to protect people. But instead of protecting people, it's keeping us from this healthy competition that's getting us better services, getting us better products. You know, it's often been said that the reason computers could accelerate, progress so fast in technology is that government couldn't keep up with technology to kind of legislate it to slow down like it does with the other fields. So thanks to the government thinking they're helping us, they're actually making things worse.
So one thing I'll say, I love spite. I think spite is a great motivator. So when you have two industry leaders who hate each other, that's great. We need more of that. Apparently that's why Shrek got created. There was some spite and stuff like that. So Shrek is another great product of spite. So I wanted to throw that in there. But actually one thing that you're talking about that I really like too is the barrier to entry side, the upfront regulation rather than the after regulation. So I've looked at a couple of studies in, I think, New Jersey, California, and some other jurisdictions. And on average, I think it's like 33% of salon foot tubs where you get your pedicures have bacteria that's banned by the government. You know, the government says you're not supposed to have this because it can cause infections. So, you know, you have to get all this experience and all this training to become a cosmetologist and to get to work. But once you're there, you can kind of do whatever you want. And I've seen this in other fields too, where there's not a lot of enforcement, there's just that upfront regulation. So I'm curious, you know, the Institute for Justice has this upside down triangle of regulation showing the least restrictive means, which is like nothing, of course, and just competition. Then you have mandatory registration, you can have health inspections. Do you all think, or I'd like to know from each of you, if you think that there's better barriers in some cases, like if you would prefer more active health inspections in certain cases instead of licensing, or just less upfront barriers and more other kinds of regulation, if that's something that, not in every case, I don't think we need to worry about florists too much, but in other cases, if that's something worth looking into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great alternative in a lot of cases. And I think why we don't see it so much is that the government is fundamentally kind of lazy and inefficient, and it's much easier to pat yourself on the back and say, you know, we've guaranteed consumer safety by having all of these upfront licensing requirements that are often sold, although that's not actually why they're there, but are often sold as being necessary to protect safety. You know, we have these upfront regulations and then we can step back because it's much harder to actually do the health inspections, to hire someone, to go out, to make sure that, you know, there's actual, people's safety is actually being protected. And so I think shifting to a, you know, perhaps slightly harder to maintain, but, you know, less invasive form of regulation, things like health inspections, would actually do what in any kind of licensing, the only real justification for it most of the time, which is actually protecting people's health and keeping them from getting ripped off.
So I'm not an advocate for more inspections of the restaurants and salons and things like that. I'm pro more inspections and licensing of our politicians, right? Let's turn this around. Instead of, you know, watching us, why don't these politicians have to apply for a license, right? To substantiate that, they know the history of this country. They know what the Constitution is about. They know what the Bill of Rights is about, right? To be able to monitor them. And with that license comes some recertification, some expiration period to say, you can be a politician, you've been certified with this license for 4 years, and then it expires. Why is that only thrust upon me? Why not the politicians also be subject to that? That's my perspective.
On that note, there's actually something that I'm not sure if a lot of people here are familiar with, but it's the principle of decertification for police officers, that when you have, you know, a bad actor moving from one state to another or something like that, that a lot of times their credentials aren't really checked that easily, but if you have a national certification and decertification database, that's something kind of up that alley that I really like.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure.
Sorry, didn't mean to get all passionate about that.
How dare you?
Thank you.
You're saying that to a libertarian crowd? So I believe competition is good in everything, even the inspection. I'm going to loosely say inspection, meaning private inspection as well as public inspection. I would suggest that it's easier to have corruption in the government-run licensing and inspection and barriers because there's nobody watching them. And I talked with somebody who lived in Chicago, was one of these guys on, he went out and inspected the construction going on, and he's like, here's your hard hat, here's your little sheet, your little checklist, and just go off and put yes to all of these. He didn't say go out and actually look. He said, just be sure you just check yes on all these. Kind of like, don't worry, wink, wink, we've been paid. You can have a health inspector who comes in and gets paid. And what happens? What's the downside? Is the government going to go out of business? Are people going to say, well, we don't want to listen to them anymore? No, but if you have private people going out there giving their opinions, such as the Michelin stars, such as Yelp, and yes, there are problems with that too, but look at Michelin, which has been around for decades. If they went out and they said, oh, this is a 5-star restaurant, and it sucked, people would say, you know what, maybe we're not going to pay money to Michelin, maybe we're not going to listen to them anymore, and they'd go out of business. So only the government can get away with going out and saying, yes, this is a great product, when it's not.
That's a really good point there. And it's funny because on IJ's list is like a competitive certification, stuff like that. So there's a lot of things between everything and nothing. You can have some stuff in there. One thing I'd also be curious about is there's so many kinds of occupational licensing reforms. Politicians really love basically where you can take your license and move it to another state, understandably, because mobility is a really big issue. And it's a big reason people have economic mobility. If you can move somewhere, you can move there for a better job, stuff like that. There's also just getting rid of some stuff. It depends on the state, but I mean, Louisiana hasn't been able to get rid of its florist license. We have tried for a very long time. It hasn't worked. Some hair braiding licenses have gone away. There's also justice reforms, making sure that if you're prohibited from doing a job, that there's a really good means ends fit, that it's not just like you can't work at anything ever again because you have an unrelated conviction. So there's all those and more kinds of reforms. Utah is actually working to match immigrant credentials to US credentials, which is something that we really need to do. But there's a ton of stuff to do. What do you each think that elected officials should focus on? Do you think there's a better reform? Do you think it has to be all or nothing? Or do you think there's something where it's like, if we can't get full reform, these are some good solutions in there?
Well, I think elected officials would be able to convince constituents that occupational licenses aren't necessary if they can show that the reason that they're being marketed, which as I said, is usually safety, it doesn't actually do what it's supposedly meant to do. If you can say, okay, requiring hair braiders to get a license, requiring, I'm thinking about the cosmetology related ones, requiring someone to go to cosmetology school, it doesn't actually keep people safer, it doesn't actually keep them from being ripped off, and we can prove it, right? There aren't fewer, I don't know if this is true necessarily, but there aren't fewer traffic deaths, say, by requiring all of these extra hours to be a trucker or something like that. If they can prove that, I think it would be easier to convince people to support measures that involve just getting rid of unnecessary licenses. I think fundamentally that's the most important reform, is to open up the market for more competition, really start ignoring these special interests from people who already have the licenses, who want to artificially restrict the supply of labor, and really just open up the market for real competition and for new, better ideas to come about.
That's the second time this concept of competition has come up, and I think it's a very valuable point. And it's not something that we should invite the government into this sort of this conversation. We ourselves that operate within industry, we should get with our peers. We should understand, should there be some sort of regulation? Should we self-regulate more? I operate within the real estate industry, and many, many times we have these types of these conversations to talk about, like, it's not all about the money. I know a lot of people think, hey, these industries are, these companies are about the money and profit and maximize. Yes, that's important to us, but there's also a socio-economic hodgepodge of things we talk about, right? One of the things we talk about within real estate is how to help the less fortunate out there obtain affordable housing, right? And whether we dedicate a certain percentage of our housing towards, disadvantaged socioeconomic classes or whatnot, or individuals. So we self-regulate, right? That makes us better, that makes us stronger. That's our give back to our community. We don't need the government coming in and telling us 20% of your properties should be rented to the less fortunate or those in poverty. We don't need them to do that. We do that. We self-regulate ourselves, and there needs to be more of a cry for companies and industries to do that self-regulation. Let's not rely on the politicians to mandate that. We need to encourage that amongst ourselves rather than having the politicians dictate, because they know nothing about our industry. They know nothing about, I've seen people, present to Congress about crypto and Bitcoin. I'm looking at the audience, I'm looking at this, Congress, and I'm like, these folks are, not for nothing, they're like 60, 70, 80 years old. Their experience, and not to say because you're of a certain age, you don't know about crypto, but their vernacular, their ability to regulate that industry is very far impaired from the industry itself regulating itself. So I think we just need to have more of a cry for industry to do a better job with its own regulation.
So being a libertarian, of course, my first response, the response through every bone in my body, is get rid of all government licensing. However, I realize that not only is that practically very difficult to do, but a lot of people, they would be uncomfortable with it. It might be hard to convince people that, no, we don't need to license your dentist, even though research shows it does no good. So for incremental steps, and again, it really hurts me to try to make government work better because government doesn't work, but okay, incremental steps, since you're asking me. I think one good thing to do would be to have licensing in one state be good for licensing in another state. So is anybody here from Hawaii? Oh, okay. Do you have and it's hard to, hey! Yes, I talked to you Friday. Or yesterday. So do you really have a cat problem? I read an article about a stray cat problem in Hawaii. Stray cats? Nope. Okay. Well, then I guess my point won't work. But I read that there are Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yes, wild cats. I read from, it seemed like a reputable source but I like to independently verify. But I read from a reputable source that a lot of the wild cats, as you call them, are eating some of the endangered species. And so they need to control the cats. And at the very least, of course, nobody likes the idea of euthanasia, but at least spay and neuter them. But the problem is you can't bring in vets from other states who would gladly come and help the problem. It's like, sure, I'll spend a week in Hawaii and go ahead and spay and neuter some of your cats. Instead, they're required, to work under a Hawaiian vet and then work there for so many months and get licensed. It's like, seriously, you're not going to trust a vet from South Carolina to be able to spay and neuter a cat in another state? So at the very least, try to set up something to where, yes, it could be transferable. Now, again, I hate to take away states' rights, I do, but I would ask the lawmakers to look at this common sense and say, hey, we've got strict requirements, again, just like going to dental school and medical school, very strict requirements for going to vet school. In fact, vet school is about as hard to get into as medical school, so it's very stringent just to get not licensed, but just to graduate. So I would suggest looking at that. And one quick note too, this is just another example of unintended consequences from the government. That the government, they try to fix a problem, and then there's 6 other problems that arise because of that. And again, we've got the people on the left who are worried about the environment, okay, well, how about easing up on your licensing laws so maybe we can help with a problem in Hawaii of some of the almost extinct species.
And that's a great example within the vet industry. Let that vet industry regulate themselves if they feel they need to be, right? To be able to offer products and services to another state where they all have the same values and belief system, right?
Well,
they all care about animals. They don't want to, just euthanize for the sake of euthanize, right? They all have that same belief system. Much like us in the real estate industry, we have a certain belief system. We're here to provide a product and a service to the population. We want to help people of all levels.
I would add to that multiple within the industry. Let's have competing groups within the industry.
A competition is, yes, we need that.
The cat issue is actually really interesting and representative of a lot of what we saw during COVID, where you needed really specialized professionals just to be able to move and go and fix stuff quickly, like whether it's hurricanes and disasters like that, or it was COVID and doctors and nurses. It's not unusual that there's just a strange emergency or just some kind of emergency where you really need a certain kind of professional, and they couldn't work across state lines. And it's funny, the cat and vet issue, it's a unique one, but that's exactly that kind of thing that I've talked about before with emergencies. And COVID was a really big era for that. Governor Ducey was the first to implement universal licensing recognition, and then a bunch of states, now we're up to more than 20, have followed. The laws aren't perfect, they're getting there, they're getting better over time, and more states are doing it. But I think COVID was a really unique era for it. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'd just be curious if you all saw anything during COVID and licensing that kind of taught lessons that we should consider moving forward. Stuff like, oh man, sometimes you need professionals in a new state, and they just have to be able to go and work there.
So my answer isn't so much during COVID, it's in sort of the aftermath of COVID that we're still dealing with education, right? So many public school systems are having really bad teacher shortages. And one of the main reasons why is sort of the after effects of COVID, both student behavioral problems, student learning, school shutdowns, and there are just not very many people, there are not enough teachers available. And so some states have loosened teacher licensing requirements and allowed people to get sort of a provisional license, or I think some states have let military members teach. And to the best of my knowledge, those teachers have done a pretty good job, right? Kids are not any more than they already are because of COVID or the aftermath of COVID. They're learning about as much as they would otherwise. And as it turns out, you probably don't need so many intensive years of education to be an educator. You don't need this really intensive licensing scheme to be a perfectly adequate public school teacher. And so, what I'm hopeful of is that more states are going to say, okay, if we want to solve our public school teacher shortage, we should just let more people who want to teach.
One of the things alongside that is the realization that we should rely more on ourselves and our communities, right? Homeschooling is a great example, because there's been, I've discovered so many families that have moved to homeschooling as a result of the pandemic, and the realization, and this is the beautiful thing, the realization that they can do it just as good, if not better than the institution, which is refreshing. To be able to have that self-realization that I can do this. I've had conversations with other folks who started growing their own vegetables during the pandemic. And the freedom that comes with that, the self-realization that I can do this, I don't need to rely on the grocery store, I don't need to rely on others for this, was liberating for them. And the same thing with during the pandemic. I know both within my family and other families where they weren't able to go to the doctor. So they had to look up their own symptoms, talk to their community and say, how should I address this issue? What should I take for, whether it's homeopathic therapy or some other type of prescription drug? How should I treat this? And it was liberating for the individuals in the communities to realize, wait a minute, I can do this on my own. And so that I think was a beautiful thing that came out of COVID.
Well, with 21 seconds left, let me just add, And looking at it from the other side, emergency, the individual emergency. You know, maybe your spouse died. Maybe something happened that now you've got a catastrophe where you need to earn some money quick. And the government is keeping you from going out and earning money right away, that the individual may need it. And time.
Thank you all so much for coming and listening to us nerd about regulatory reform.